Spoiler alert! This video has major spoilers for Avengers Endgame, so if you still haven't seen the movie, stop watching right now. Thanos is no more in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, having been built up for 7 years as the big bad of the franchise.
I'll do it myself.
And while Marvel Studios seemingly played the long game with the character, the evidence actually proves they didn't plan as far ahead as you might have thought. As a result, Thanos' introduction was flawed, with a number of inconsistencies that didn't make sense along the way. In this video, we'll tell you why his introduction made no sense, and what should have been done to make it better. Thanos was, of course, first introduced in the mid-credit scene of the Avengers back in 2012. He didn't say a word. He simply turned to the camera and smiled at the idea of courting death by challenging humans. But the only reason he even had that small cameo is because Joss Whedon is a fan of the character from the comics, and he knew he needed Loki and the other to be working for someone. But it didn't particularly matter who that someone was. The Buffy the Vampire Slayer creator has openly admitted that he had absolutely no idea at all how the whole thing would play out. But it just so happened to be around the same time that Marvel Studios looked back at Phase 1 of the MCU, as well as their early drafts of scripts for Phase 2, and came to realize that they had a number of MacGuffins that could be retconned into Infinity Stones.
It's not wise to keep two Infinity Stones so close together.
That led to the studio focusing more of their attention on the stones themselves, and not so much on Thanos, which explains why there are so many obvious differences between the Thanos seen in that mid-credits scene and the one in Guardians of the Galaxy, and the big bad who emerged in Avengers Infinity War. He was originally presented in a far more comic book accurate way, as the cosmic weirdo who wished to quite literally court death by challenging the Avengers. You may remember it was first suggested that the Mad Titan had killed Gamora's entire species, not just half the population of her planet.
Because you murdered half the planet.
Which is another indication of the lack of focus on the character in his MCU infancy. In spite of the fact he'd been teased 3 years earlier, Thanos' character and his motives in the MCU didn't really start getting pinned down by Marvel Studios until 2015, when they hired Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely to work on the script for Avengers Infinity War, as well as the movie that would become Avengers Endgame. By that point, there wasn't an awful lot that could be done about the issues and inconsistencies the developed version of the character might cause, but for the purposes of this video, let's imagine a scenario in which the character had been handled differently. Let's start with the Infinity Gauntlet, which probably created the MCU's best continuity problem as far as Thanos was concerned. A famous scene in 2011's Thor movie saw the Frost Giants raiding Odin's trophy room on Asgard, with the intention of taking the Casket of Ancient Winters and restoring Jotunheim to its former glory. In the background, visible for only a couple of frames, we got a glimpse of the Infinity Gauntlet, and what was probably the MCU's coolest Easter egg up until that point. Then, following his appearance in 2014's Guardians of the Galaxy, which was effectively nothing more than a cameo, there was the incredibly confusing mid-credits scene of 2015's Avengers Age of Ultron. It was bizarre, quite frankly, and didn't make a lick of sense. While we'd seen him courting the Tesseract and Orb, the Space and Power Stones respectively, there was still no explanation as to why he'd even want the gauntlet at that point. And more to the point, it had suddenly switched from being a right-handed item in Odin's trophy room to being a left-handed glove in a location that hadn't even been explained. It didn't remotely fit in with Age of Ultron's main narrative, as Ultron's failed attempt to wipe out humanity shouldn't have had any influence on Thanos' decision to get his big purple butt off his chair and take any action, to the point that writers Stephen McFeely and Christopher Marcus have said they ignored the scene completely when they were working on the script for Avengers Infinity War, for the simple reason that they couldn't understand it. The Russo brothers have suggested that it might have been the moment when Thanos took the gauntlet from Nidavellir, but why would he say, "Fine, I'll do it myself," as if that was the moment he decided to collect the Infinity Stones when he'd gone to Nidavellir with the express purpose of having the Infinity Gauntlet made for that reason? The issue was half addressed in 2017's Thor Ragnarok, when Hela declared Odin's version of the gauntlet was a fake.
Fake.
But it was still all a little bit of a mess. Any attempt to tidy up this continuity mess would have had to address this issue, and without a doubt, the easiest way would have been to have Thanos take the Infinity Gauntlet from Asgard. 2014's Thor: The Dark World could have subtly reminded MCU fans that Odin had the gauntlet in his possession, perhaps by showing it in the background again as he walked through his vault with Thor and Jane Foster to read the Book of Yggdrasil. A year later, in the middle of Age of Ultron's credits, that could have been followed by a scene showing Loki, possibly disguised as Odin, handing the Infinity Gauntlet over to Thanos. It would have created a straightforward narrative link between the movies, and Loki's brief rule of Asgard after Thor: The Dark World would make its way into the ongoing story, which in reality it actually didn't until 3 years later in Thor Ragnarok. And all these continuity problems and inconsistencies would have been avoided. And it wouldn't have even meant the plot of Avengers Infinity War would have had to change much, because Thanos could have just wiped the dwarves out due to the fact that he discovered they were the ones who'd made the gauntlet and wanted to keep that a secret. Going back to Gamora, it was said in Guardians of the Galaxy that she was the last of her race. It was implied that every other member of the race was slaughtered by Thanos, leaving her as the only survivor. In fact, she specifically stated that she watched the maniac who would become her adoptive father kill her parents in front of her, before raising her to be the fiercest woman in the galaxy. That's a lot different to what the flashback scenes in Avengers Infinity War depicted, in which Thanos killed 50% of Gamora's race, including her mother, out of the youngster's view. Thanos then claimed the planet became a paradise after its culling,
With full bellies and clear skies, it's a paradise.
which is a lot different to it being completely void of life, as was earlier suggested. As we've touched upon, this issue arose because Thanos' motive hadn't been laid out at that stage. All that would have been needed to correct the issue was to slightly alter the dialogue, with Gamora simply saying that her parents were killed and that 50% of her race was killed with them. James Gunn said he wrote the script for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 without any considerations for the wider Infinity Saga. Specifically, he said, "I didn't ever have an ending for what Guardians 2 is supposed to be. I didn't have a single story point that was ever discussed with Marvel before I wrote the story. We write our own little story and then it goes off to the Russos. And I gave these guys a script very, very early on, and they were like, that's perfect, because that works great for us with where Nebula is, what we want to do with the story, and it goes off." It's obviously good that MCU directors have room to do their own thing, but Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 could have used a little work with regards to Thanos. The dynamic between Gamora and Nebula was undoubtedly one of the movie's highlights, and it reached its peak when the adoptive sisters resolved their differences in brutal fashion.
And I just wanted a sister!
With just a little work and a flashback scene featuring their adoptive father, it could have been even stronger. We could, for example, have gotten more of a feel for the love Thanos felt for Gamora, which would have made that scene on Vormir in Infinity War seem more genuine.
I'm sorry, little one.
The final adjustment we'd make would be to explain why Thanos waited until 2018 before he made his move to collect the Infinity Stones. A theme of Phase 3 of the MCU was the death of the mentors and powerful characters who could potentially have thwarted the Mad Titan's plans, and we're not even sure if that theme was intentional. The Ancient One and Odin both died, and both of those powerful mentors could potentially have stopped Thanos, even if he'd obtained a couple of the Infinity Stones. Ego, Hela, and Surtur also died, and you have to imagine that they wouldn't have taken too kindly to the Mad Titan exerting his influence on the entire universe. What makes us believe the theme was unintentional is that some drafts of Doctor Strange kept the Ancient One alive, but it wouldn't have been at all difficult to weave this into the actual story of the MCU. In her death scene, the Ancient One could have explicitly referred to an evil force emerging, one she couldn't see clearly because it would arrive after her demise. It would only have required a slight tweak to what she actually said before she passed away, but it would have seamlessly tied her into the wider MCU narrative, and Bruce Banner might have had an easier time convincing her to hand over the Time Stone if it was to combat an evil that she had personally sensed the arrival of. And what about that mid-credit scene from Thor Ragnarok? The one where we got to see Thor and Loki watching in horror as Thanos' enormous spacecraft, the Sanctuary 2, arrived and cast its ample shadow over the Asgardian refugee vessel. But that only really served to lightly tease the pre-credits scene in Infinity War, without giving anything substantial away. It would have been much better if it had been presented from Thanos' perspective, with the Mad Titan preparing that very same attack. Thanos could have said something referencing the fact that the All-Father was dead and that nothing was left standing in his way in his quest to collect the Infinity Stones. In particular, the Tesseract in this instance. It would have explained why he'd spent so much time sitting on his special chair and doubled up as a tease for the Black Order, who were massively underdeveloped in the franchise prior to their debuts in Infinity War. Before we finish, we'd just like to point out that this really isn't meant as a criticism of Marvel Studios. What they've done with the MCU is an incredible feat of cinema, and frankly, unprecedented. They've completely reinvented long-form storytelling in Hollywood. And in the grand scheme of things, Thanos makes enough sense as a character that our enjoyment hasn't been hindered by the odd continuity error. Nobody knew if the franchise would be a success when it launched with Iron Man in 2008, not least Marvel Studios. The franchise is now the highest grossing in cinema history, with a total worldwide gross of more than $20 billion. It is, however, worth pointing out that the success papers over what are undoubtedly cracks created along the way, and those cracks are never more obvious than when you look back at the way Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet were set up. Going forward in the franchise, which we have to emphasize is far from finished, we'd feel it important to revisit those mistakes in order to ensure they aren't repeated in Phase 4. We're sure Marvel Studios has learned their lesson, and we can't wait to discover what else they have for us in store. Do you think Thanos' introduction to the MCU made no sense? Do you agree with how we think it could have been fixed? Sound off in the comments section below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Screen Rant so you never miss our great new content in the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.